How you doing there? Welcome back to Babble on Talmud. Today we're studying Daf Yomi Chullin, Daf 34 of Masechta Chullin. Friends, Daf 34 is an absolute and complete head spinner. An absolute head spinner. We're gonna spin your head and just hope that we do it 360 so that when it stops spinning, you're still looking straight forward. Anyways. Sheesh. What are we talking about? We're talking about eating Tumah. It's going to be an absolute head spinner. I just hope my brain is still functioning at the end of it. We're going to have to push through some mush over here. But anyways, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about eating Tumah as it relates to the Mishnah that we saw yesterday about shechting an animal, a bloodless shchita, and because of the bloodless shchita, so you don't have to wash your hands, you don't have to worry about tumah, and we're still answering that question of why don't you have to worry about tumah, meaning that if there's no blood, you don't have to worry about tumah, but if there is blood, you have to worry about tumah. So the question is why? Your hands are shtayim, and you can't make shlishi by chulin. So yesterday we had said that your hands are actually a rishon. Anyways, we're going to give another answer for that today, and boy, oh boy, it's going to be something else. Join me. Let's enjoy Daf Lamed Daled, Daf 34 of Masechta Chullin. All right, friends, we begin on Daf Lamed Gimel Amud Beis, Daf 33 Amud Beis, about 10 lines or so from the bottom. I feel like we're about to literally climb a mountain. I'm just imagining all of the explaining that I'm going to have to do right now. It's a bit overwhelming, but it's going to be first of all, just to clarify, it's going to be an unbelievable daf. It's going to be it's all about Tumah and Tara, which is really hard and difficult, but it's also amazing at the same time. So it's going to require a lot of energy, and I'm just knowing that I have to climb this massive mountain, and we're just getting started. But it's going to be unbelievable. Here we go. We start on Daf Lamed Gimel Amud Beis, about 10 lines from the bottom. Amar Belazar, Amar Boshaya, Hacha b'chulin shenaisu al tyrus akodesh askinu l'dlok Rabbi Yoshua. Okay, so as I mentioned in the introduction, this is getting back to our question of how to understand our Mishnah from yesterday. We said in our Mishnah from yesterday that if one slaughters an animal, behema chay v'of, whether it's an animal, chay like a deer or an oaf, a bird, and it was a bloodless shchita. So there was no dam. So we say because there was no dam, so we say, okay, the shchita is kosher. And in terms of your hands, right, stam yadayim shnios l'tumayin, right, stam yadayim are midrabanan, they are considered to be a sheni l'tuma. And we say that because there was no blood, so since there was no blood, so the animal, the meat, is not mukhshel lekabel tumah, because you need the food in order to become tamei, tumas ochlin, would have to first come in contact with one of the 7 liquids. One of them is blood, and because there was no blood, so therefore the meat is not mukhshel lekabel tumah. Because it's not mukhshel lekabel tumah, your hands that are sheni letumas won't be metame the meat. To which we asked yesterday that I don't understand, if we're talking about shechting chulin maxes out at sheni letumah. So therefore, if your hands are already sheni l'tumah, they can't make the animal into a shlishi l'tumah. If we're talking about chulin, so we had said yesterday that it's talking about a scenario where actually your hands are a rishon l'tumah, and therefore it can make the animal into sheni l'tumah. Now we see this shita here of Rabbi Elazar Amar Boshaya, hacha b'chulin shenaisu al tyrus akodesh askinon. Here we are talking about chulin shenaisu al tyrus akodesh. So okay. So I think we mentioned maybe yesterday. Did we mention yesterday chulin shenaisu al tyrus atruma? Maybe we did. So chulin shenaisu al tyrus akodesh is talking about if you have a person that eats a lot of korbanos. Okay. So if a person he eats maybe a lot of korban shlamim, maybe he's a kohen, he eats a lot of korbanos in the Beis Hamikdash, and therefore he wants to get in the habit of just always being pure to be able to eat korbanos, right? He wants to avoid a scenario where he eats a lot of korbanos, where he's going to eat a korban and he's going to say, wait a second, dang, I was tameh at the time. So he wants to get into the habit of just always being tahor, always being in a position that anything that he's eating, he is tahor first. And this is totally doable, right? Because after all, we, right, in terms of chulin shenaisu al taras truma, that's basically one of the reasons for why we wash netilas yadayim before we eat bread, right? Right. The Mishnah Berurah gives two reasons for why we wash netilas yadayim before we eat bread. One of them is just for cleanliness and kedusha. The other one is that, well, because during the time of the Beis Hamikdash, hopefully the Beis Hamikdash will be rebuilt today, immediately. And in the time of the Beis Hamikdash, so nowadays we don't eat truma. Nobody eats truma nowadays because we're all tummy tumas sameis. So we don't have efer paraduma. We can't become Torah. Everyone's tummy tumas sameis, and therefore nobody can eat truma because you can't eat truma in a state of tuma. Although Aitaka saw on Daf Lamed Aleph, there was a very interesting shita in the side. There was a note from that goes Ma'arav Ranchberg, and he had said that actually during the time of the Amoraim in Eretz Yisrael, they still had Efer Para Aduma, and they actually were able to be Matayr themselves, and they were able to eat Truma. Isn't that unbelievable? But anyways, but so nowadays nobody eats Truma, but nonetheless, because in the time of the Beis HaMikdash, Kohanim would eat Truma, so therefore they kind of instituted that everybody should just always wash their hands before eating bread, because apparently most of the truma was kind of grain, was things like wheat and barley, and normally you would eat that as bread, right? Mostly when we eat it as bread. So like kind of the main way to consume truma apparently would be bread, and therefore they made a takana that let's just get everybody into the habit of always washing your hands before eating bread. And that way, that will help with ensuring that Kohanim are always tahor when they're eating truma. And based on that, I mean, everyone, when they eat, I think for many, if not most people, we don't even think about eating bread before we wash. Of course, if you can eat bread, you wash, right? So, meaning the point I'm making is that you can get in the habit of making sure that before you eat bread, you always wash. And therefore, you have a person who often eats korbanos, and therefore, he wants to make sure that he's just always, whenever he eats meat, he's always going to wash netilas yadayim first. He's always going to make sure that he's pure, that his hands are pure before he's going to be eating any meat. That way, if he's eating korbanos, he's also going to make sure to wash his hands first, wash netilas yadayim first as well. So we're talking about a person like that. So we're talking about a person who's makbid, that even when he eats chulin, right, he's a person who often eats kachim. Therefore, he just makes sure that whenever he's dealing with meat, he always washes netilas yadayim first, and he's gonna make sure his hands are tahor before he eats meat. So says Reb Elazar Reb Oshaya that's what we're talking about in our Mishnah. Our Mishnah, when we're saying that because there's no blood, he doesn't have to worry about doing netilas yadayim, it's because we're talking about a person who eats all the meat that he eats. He wants to do it al taras hakodesh with the purity that he would have if he was eating kachim. And when it comes to kachim, so kachim can even be a revi l'tumah, right? If you have, let's say you have a dead mouse and it touches food, that food would be a rishon l'tumah. If that food touches other food, that other food would be a sheni l'tumah. If it touches kodesh, that kodesh would be a shlishi l'tumah. And if that kodesh touches other kodesh, it would be a revi l'tumah. So kodesh can go all the way to being a revi l'tumah. And therefore, if it was a blood-full shchita and you shechted this animal and there was plenty of blood and now the animal is mukhshel l'kabel tumah, so if it's mukhshel l'kabel tumah, your hands that are sheni l'tumas, since you are makbid that whenever you're eating meat, you want to treat it with the same level of strictness as if it were kodesh. So even though we're talking about chulin, because as we said yesterday, we gave like 4 or 5 reasons why the Mishnah can't be talking about kodesh. So even though we're talking about chulin, but we're talking about a person who is makbid that when it comes to chulin, he treats it in the same way, no different than he would treat kodesh. And since kodesh can be a shlishi and even a revi, that is why we're saying that his hands would be mitame this meat, that even though it's chulin, we're treating it in the same way that we treat kodesh, and his hands were therefore mitame this meat to be a shlishi. That is what we're talking about. Also, I want to give also just to point out, this is a very technical daf, and we're going to be talking about rishons and shenis and shlishis and all sorts of stuff. And I just feel like it's probably inevitable, even though I'm going to try my hardest to make sure that I don't mix things up. I do feel like it's probably inevitable that I'm going to mess something up. So if you think that I said Rishon when I should have said Sheni or something like that, feel free to ask in WhatsApp. I'll clarify anything. Obviously, I'll try to make sure, I'll try as hard as I can to make sure I get everything right. But just in case I make a mistake, feel free to ask. I'm happy to answer, or hopefully everything will be clear. Okay, so again, our Mishnah is talking about a person who's makbid, that even though, yes, it's talking about chulin, but he treats chulin in the same way that he would treat kodesh, and that's why his sheni hands would make it into a shlishi, because by kodesh you would have a shlishi. You can have a shlishi l'tumah. Udelo Rabbi Yoshua, and therefore this is unlike Rabbi Yoshua. Therefore, our Mishnah would be unlike Rabbi Yoshua, because Rabbi Yoshua says that that there's no concept of a shlishi by chulin shenaisu al tairas hakodesh. By chulin shenaisu al tairas hakodesh, there's no concept of a shlishi according to Rabbi Yoshua. It's not that we learn in a Mishnah in Masechta Tairis, that we learn in a Mishnah Masechta Tairis Perek Beis Mishnah Beis. I'm going to have a shluk of tea. Now we learn in a Mishnah, Masechta Tairis, Perek Beis, Mishnah Beis, Rabbi Eliezer, or Mesilas Rabbi Eliezer, ha'ochel rishon, sheni, shlishi. So Rabbi Eliezer is more straightforward. Rabbi Eliezer's opinion is that be'etzim you are what you eat. If a person eats food that's a rishon l'tumah, so that person becomes a rishon l'tumah, and if they then touch food, it'll become a sheni l'tumah, etc. If a person who is a sheni l'tumah, if a person eats food that's a sheni l'tumah, so the person will become a sheni l'tumah. If the person eats food that's a shlishi l'tumah, so it will become a shlishi l'tumah. You are what you eat, be'etzim, according to Rabbi Eliezer. Again, Rabbi Eliezer says, Rabbi Eliezer, ochel rishon. If a person eats food that's a rishon l'tumah, he becomes rishon l'tumah. Sheni, person who eats food that's a sheni l'tumah, he becomes a sheni l'tumah. Shlishi, and if the food's a shlishi l'tumah, he becomes a shlishi l'tumah. Now, Rabbi Yoshua is where the complexity comes in, and that's really where our daf is going to get its complexity from. Rabbi Eliezer was pretty straightforward. Rabbi Yoshua be'etzim says that everything is going to make the person a sheni l'tumah. Be'etzim. Rabbi Yeshua says, ochel rishon v'sheni sheni. Says Rabbi Yeshua that if a person eats food that is either a rishon l'tumah, or if the food's a sheni l'tumah, he becomes a sheni l'tumah. So, i.e., in other words, if a person eats food that's a rishon l'tumah, he becomes a sheni l'tumah. If he eats food that's a sheni l'tumah, he also becomes a sheni l'tumah. And guess what? If he eats food that's a shlishi l'tumah, it's more complicated, but let's say he's also a sheni l'tumah. We're about to see it. It's more complicated, but be'etzim he's a sheni l'tumah. So whether he eats a rishon or a sheni or a shlishi, he's a sheni l'tumah. Again, Rabbi Yeshua says, Rabbi Yeshua, ha'ochel rishon, a person who eats food that's a rishon l'tumah, v'sheni, or if he eats food that's a sheni l'tumah, sheni. Either way, he becomes a sheni l'tumah. Shlishi, now if he eats food that's a shlishi l'tumah, sheni, so he becomes a sheni l'tumah. However, this is complicated. It's very detailed. Pay attention. Likodesh ve'ein sheni l'truma. Let's go weiter for a second. Bechulin shenaisu al tairas truma. And Rabbi Shua says, what's the shlishi that we're talking about? We're talking about chulin shenaisu al tairas truma. Okay, so let's explain what we just read, because there's a million details there, specifically about the shlishi l'tumah. So it says, Rabbi Yeshua, how could it be that we have a shlishi l'tumah? Right, when it comes to a rishon l'tumah, sheni l'tumah, that could be chulin, right? Chulin could be a rishon l'tumah, chulin could be a sheni l'tumah. How do you get to a shlishi l'tumah? So it says, Rabbi Yeshua, that we're talking about chulin shenaisu al tairas atruma. We're talking about chulin, but here we're talking about somebody who eats truma, I guess a kohen, somebody who eats truma, and like we do before we eat bread, we always wash bread to get into the habit of making sure that we're always going to, be tahor before, essentially we all wash our hands before eating bread, so that the Kohanim will also be washing their hands before eating truma. But anyways, so this is a person who is always makpid. So in our Mishnah in Tyrus, we're talking about a person who is always makpid, that even chulin, he's going to treat with the same level of purity as he would truma. Even chulin, he'll eat al tyrus at truma. And therefore, just like by truma, if truma touches food that's a sheni l'tumah, the truma will become a shlishi l'tumah. So even this chulin, even though chulin maxes out at a sheni l'tumah, because this is a person who is not just going to say, oh, nish geferlich, it's chulin, it's okay if there is no concept of a shlishi. No. He's always treating everything in the same way that he would treat truma. And he says, well, since if it was truma, it would be a shlishi l'tumah. So I'm going to treat this chulin also now as a shlishi l'tumah. And then so a person eats this chulin that touched the sheni l'tumah and became a shlishi l'tumah, and it was chulin shenaisu al tyrus truma, and he ate this chulin shenaisu al tyrus truma that was a shlishi. Now says Rabbi Yoshua, so now what happens to him? He becomes a sheni, but there's a lot more to say. He becomes a sheni l'tumah, but only with regard to kodesh, specifically when it comes to touching with regard to kodesh. So meaning, if he touches kodesh, now that kodesh will be a shlishi, and if that kodesh touches other kodesh, it will become a revi. So a person who eats a shlishi of chulin shenaisu al tyrus truma, that person becomes a sheni to the extent that when it comes to kodesh, if he touches kodesh, that kodesh will be a shlishi. What about truma? So it says Rabbi Yeshua, if he touches truma, it will not become a shlishi. He's not a sheni vis-a-vis truma. If he touches truma, so this person who ate a shlishi by chulin shenaisu al tyrus truma becomes a sheni to the extent that if he touches kodesh, it will be a shlishi, but if he touches truma, it won't become a shlishi. There's one final detail, which is, it definitely doesn't help to make things easy and clear, but it is an important detail that I have to point out. It's going to become relevant later. That when we say, in terms of truma, that he's not a sheni l'truma, and therefore if he touches truma, it does not become a shlishi. He's not a sheni for truma, but he is a shlishi for truma. What does that mean? That vis-a-vis truma he's a shlishi? It means he can't eat truma. So if he touches truma, it won't become a shlishi, but we'll say that he becomes a shlishi vis-a-vis truma, that he's not allowed to eat truma. So this person ate chulin shenaisu al tyrus truma, that was a shlishi, and he ate it now. So in terms of truma, he becomes a shlishi, i.e. he's a shlishi l'tumah, and as a person who's tummy, he can't eat truma. In terms of kodesh, he becomes a sheni, so now if he touches kodesh, that kodesh will be a shlishi. But if he touches truma, it won't become a shlishi. Chaver, we're just scratching the surface here. Okay. So let's read that again. Rabbi Yeshua Omer, says Rabbi Yeshua, ha'ochel ochel rishon v'sheni. If a person eats ochel that is a rishon l'tumah or a sheni l'tumah, sheni, he becomes a sheni l'tumah. Shlishi, if he eats ochel that's a shlishi l'tumah, and how could it be a shlishi l'tumah? We're talking about chulin shenaisu al tyrus truma, therefore it could become a shlishi, as we're going to point out in a minute. So by eating the shlishi, he becomes a sheni only vis-a-vis la kodesh, that if he touches kodesh, the kodesh will be a shlishi. The ain't sheni la truma, but he's not a sheni for truma. And if he touches truma, it does not become a shlishi. And then, however, I do want to point out, as is going to be important to point out now for later, it says the ain't sheni la truma, but the diuk is, but he is a shlishi for truma, i.e., he's tummy and he can't eat truma. Okay, so a person who eats a shlishi, which is chulin shenaisu al tyrus truma, can't eat truma. And this is talking about bechulin shenaisu al tyrus truma, and in terms of the shlishi, we're talking about chulin shenaisu al tyrus truma. Okay. I mean, I think the Firashi could also be by the Rishon and Sheni, but I don't see why it can't also be chulin by the Rishon and Sheni. Okay. Fine. I was just drinking some tea. Okay, here we go. So b'chulin shenaisu ataris truma. So we want to be medayek from Reb Yoshua Shita Altaris Truma in Altaris HaKodesh Lo. That Reb Yoshua Davka said that in the Mishnah, when we're talking about a shlishi, we're talking about chulin shenaisu Altaris Truma, but we're not talking about chulin shenaisu Altaris HaKodesh. Right, Kodesh being korbanos. Kasavar chulin shenaisu Altaris HaKodesh leis bu shlishi. Because Rabbi Yoshua holds that chulin shenaisu altaris akodesh, there's no shlishi there, and therefore, if we're talking about shlishi, it's dafka chulin shenaisu altaris truma, not chulin shenaisu altaris akodesh, because there's no shlishi for chulin shenaisu altaris akodesh. And therefore, Rabbi Lazar Rabbi Shaya pointed out that it's delok Rabbi Yoshua, that our Mishnah, where he's shechting this animal, and we're saying that we have to be concerned that his hands that are shenis are going to make a shlishi for this meat. And we said it's talking about because it's a person who's makbid even by chulin, that it should be altaris hakodesh, and therefore he wants to make sure that this meat shouldn't become a shlishi. It can't be like Rabbi Yeshua, because Rabbi Yeshua says that there is no concept of shlishi by chulin shenaisu altaris hakodesh. Now, frag the Gemara v'lukma bechulin shenaisu altaris truma v'Rabbi Yeshua. Why not say that our Mishnah is talking about chulin shenaisu altaris truma? That it's a person who's makbid to eat truma in a state of taira. And Rabbi Yeshua had said that by chulin shenaisu altaris truma, there is a concept of a shlishi. So why not say that our Mishnah is talking about a person who's makbid to eat chulin altaris truma, and therefore he's makbid for shlishi, and that's why we're concerned that his hands might make the meat a shlishi. Says the Gemara, well, that doesn't really make sense. Lo sagadati l'chatani basar, because we're talking about meat. A person who's makbid to make sure that he's always going to be able to eat truma in a state of taira doesn't need to worry about washing his hands for meat. Kilu, for example, we don't wash our hands like netilas yadayim before we eat meat, and yet we wouldn't think twice, many of us, if not most of us, we wouldn't think twice before eating bread. No. 1 second. How are we going to wash? If you're eating bread, you have to wash. Even though we eat meat, not me, but you didn't eat meat all the time without washing the netilas yadayim. Hopefully they wash with soap first, but not like, netilas yadayim with a cup. And yet we wouldn't think twice about eating bread without washing our hands first, netilas yadayim. So therefore, says the Gemara, a person who's makbid to eat truma altaris hakodesh, chulin altaris hatruma, has no need to wash their hands before eating meat, because you can eat meat without washing netilas yadayim and still have no problem making sure to wash your hands before eating truma. And therefore, says the Gemara, since the Mishnah is talking about meat, it doesn't make sense to say that it'll become a shlishi because it's a person who's makbid to eat chulin altaris hatruma. That has nothing to do with meat. The ibit truma, and if it's a person who's makbid to eat chulin altaris hatruma, basar miika. Well, there's no truma for meat. Truma is for things that grow from the ground, and therefore, it's okay to touch for a person who's makbid to eat chulin altaris hatruma. It would be okay for him to touch the meat with his hands that are sheni. Elamai bikachim. Wait, so what? You're telling me that we're talking about a person who's makbid to eat chulin altaris hakodesh? Chaya bikachim miika. The Mishnah, however, said that we're talking about a person who shechs a behema chaya v'of. Sure, I can understand why you want to be makbid by a behema to eat it. Said it shouldn't be a shlishi, or by an oaf that it shouldn't be a shlishi, because they could be offered as korbanos. Chayas are not offered as korbanos. If you're slaughtering a deer, so why should you? So okay, if it's a person who's makbid to eat chulin altaris hakodesh, but this deer can never be a korban anyway. So why do you have to care about your hands being a sheni and making it a shlishi? Who cares? It's never going to be a korban. Answers the Gemara. Basar bebasar michalef, basar bepere lo michalef. Here's the difference. The difference is, as I pointed out a minute ago, we eat meat without, we as in the big we. I don't eat meat. But we eat meat without washing netilas yadayim. And yet, we would never think twice about eating we would never think about eating bread without first washing the netilas yadayim. So kilu, there's a separation there between I can eat meat without washing the netilas yadayim, and still I would never think to eat bread or truma without washing the netilas yadayim first. But a person who's makbid to eat chulin ataris hakodesh, because he eats a lot of korbanos, will say all meat you need to wash netilas yadayim first. Because if you have a person, there is a concern that if you have a person who eats venison, he eats deer meat, and he doesn't get in the habit, maybe a person who eats a lot of deer meat, and he doesn't get into the habit of washing netilas yadayim for eating deer meat, well then there is a concern that he might end up eating goat meat or cow meat without washing netilas yadayim. So therefore, ein chinami that deer are not offered as korbanos, but it is meat. And korbanos are meat, whether it's cow meat, goat meat, sheep meat, bird meat. So a person who eats korbanos, who eats meat, and he wants to be makbid to make sure that he gets in the habit of always washing netilas yadayim before eating meat, so that would include all meat, even the meat of a chaya. But if it's a person who is makbid to eat chulin al tairis atruma, you don't have to be concerned about meat. And therefore, our Mishnah that talks about your hands that are a sheni, making this animal that you're shechting a shlishi, we would say it's talking about that a person who's makbid to eat chulin al tairis hakodesh, that's why he could become a shlishi, and it's unlike Rabbi Yeshua, because Rabbi Yeshua says that chulin shenais al tairis hakodesh doesn't become a shlishi, so this must not be like Rabbi Yeshua. Omar Ula says Ula, Chevraya Amrin b'chulin shenaisu al tairis hakodesh v'dilo Rabbi Yeshua v'ona amina Rabbi Yeshua v'lo mibayik Amar lo mibayik chulin shenaisu al tairis hakodesh dechamira deizbu shlishi elo afilu chulin shenaisu al tairis trumanami izbu shlishi. Says Ula, we'll read it again. Says Ula, look, my friends, my colleagues, they explained the Mishnah like we explained it just now. That the Mishnah is talking about chulin shenaisu al tairis hakodesh, which is why it could become a shlishi. And they say that it's not like Rabbi Yeshua, like we explained. However, says Ula, I say that, yeah, the Mishnah is talking about chulin shenaisu al tairis hakodesh, sure, but it's even like Rabbi Yeshua. But it's even like Rabbi Yeshua. That when Rabbi Yeshua says that our Mishnah, that when Rabbi Yeshua says in the Mishnah in Tyrus about the Shlishi being a Sheni for Kodshim, but not for Truma, etc., that whole thing. In the Mishnah in Tyrus, when Rabbi Yeshua says that we're talking about Chulin Shenaisu al Tyrus Atrume, and that's the Shlishi that we're talking about, it's not to the exclusion of Chulin Shenaisu al Tairis HaKodesh. Right? When Rabbi Yeshua says that the Mishnah in Tyrus is saying Chulin Shenaisu al Tairis Atrume, it's not to the exclusion of al Tairis HaKodesh. It's not to say that according to Rabbi Yeshua, Chulin Shenaisu al Tairis HaKodesh cannot be a Shlishi. Says Ula, it can even be talking about Chulin Shenaisu al Tairis Atrume. That Chulin Shenaisu al Tairis HaKodesh, Kodshim, is more Chomer than Truma, which is also going to be important later on today's daf. That Kodshim is more Chomer than Truma. Maybe not. Maybe even I'll just plant this seed right now. If you remember on daf Lamed, we learned a Mishnah in Masechta Chagiga. We learned a Mishnah in Masechta Chagiga, Perek Beis Mishnah Vav, where we had talked about, remember the Nida who fell into the mikvah, and we talked about when you go to the mikvah, there's 5 levels. The first level is Chulin, the next level up is Meiser Sheni, the next level up is Truma, the next level up is Kodesh, and then the 5th level up is Mei Chatas, right? Paraduma, water that has ashes of the Paraduma in it. So we see that there are levels, and in terms of levels, it goes Chulin, Meiser Sheni, Truma, and then Kodesh. So Kodesh is more Chamor than Truma. So it says Ula, no, what Rabbi Yeshua is saying, of course, Chulin Shenaisu al Tairis HaKodesh has a Shlishi, but even Chulin Shenaisu al Tairis HaTruma, which is not as Chamor, it also can be a shlishi. Okay, so let's read it again. Amar Ula says, Ula, Chevraya, my colleagues, my friends, Amrin b'chulin shenaisu ataras hakodesh. They said that our Mishnah is talking about chulin shenaisu ataras hakodesh, and that's why we're concerned about the meat being a shlishi in our Mishnah. V'dilok Rabbi Yeshua, and it's unlike Rabbi Yeshua, because Rabbi Yeshua in the Mishnah in Tyrus had said that Davka the Shlishi is by Chulin Shnaisu al Tyrus a Trume. Ve'ana Amina, but says, Ula, I disagree, and I say that the Mishnah can even be according to Rabbi Yeshua. Ve'ana Amina, Rabbi Yeshua, no, the Mishnah, our Mishnah, is also according to Rabbi Yeshua. Is according to Rabbi Yeshua as well. V'lo mibaya ka'amar, and Rabbi Yeshua is saying not only this, but even that lo mibaya chulin shenaisu ataris hakodesh. Of course, chulin shenaisu ataris hakodesh, which is more chamer than trume, dichamire, which are more chamer, disbu shlishi. Of course, chulin shenaisu ataris hakodesh have a shlishi, according to Rabbi Yeshua. And what he's saying in the Mishnah in Tyrus is ela afilu chulin shenaisu ataris truma, even chulin that was treated al tyrus hatrume, even which is less chamor, nami isbu shlishi, also has a shlishi the tumah, and if you eat it, you become a sheni, etc. So Ula wants to say, Ula disagrees with what we had said earlier, and said that our Mishnah, when you're slaughtering the animal, when your hands are a sheni, it can even be according to Rabbi Yeshua. Fine. Because our Mishnah is talking about Chulin Shnai Ataris HaKodesh, and it could be a Shlishi even according to Rabbi Yoshua, as explained by Ula. Man Chevraya, who are the colleagues? Right? Ula had said, my colleagues had explained the Mishnah as we did earlier, to say that it's not Rabbi Yoshua, explained our Mishnah to say it's not Rabbi Yoshua. Who is that? Rabbi Bar Bachana. It's Rabbi Bar Bachana. And now we're going to see Rabbi Bar Bachana in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, that he gives us a whole behind the scenes in the machlokes between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua. Rabbi Eliezer, who says you are what you eat a rishon, you become a rishon. You eat a sheni, you become a sheni. You eat a shlishi, you become a shlishi. Rabbi Eliezer says you are what you eat, and Rabbi Yeshua, who is much more complicated, he says if you eat a rishon, you become a sheni. If you eat a sheni, you become a sheni. If you eat a shlishi, you kind of also become a sheni in some ways. That is Rabbi Bar Bachana's opinion, because we're about to quote a whole give and take, a complicated grind, amazing grind of a give and take between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua about their machlokes, and at the very end of the give and take, and at the very end of the behind the scenes, we are going to see how Rabbi Bar Bachana holds that our Mishnah cannot be according to Rabbi Yeshua. The Rabbi Bar Bachana, Rabbi Yochanan says, Rabbi Bar Bachana, name Rabbi Yochanan, my ahadre, Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Yeshua. What was a little bit of the behind the scenes there in the machlokes between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua? How did Rabbi Eliezer respond to Rabbi Yeshua? My ahadre, Rabbi Yeshua, Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Yeshua, le'adadi, what was their back and forth? Here it is. Here is their back and forth. Amar lo Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Yeshua. Rabbi Eliezer says to Rabbi Yeshua, I don't understand, Rabbi Yeshua. I don't understand. According to me, you are what you eat. You eat a rishon, you become a rishon. Rabbi Yeshua, I don't understand why you're saying that a person eats a rishon, he becomes a sheni. I don't get it. Because matzinu ochel chamor mina ochel. Chaver, what the heck does that mean? Ochel chamor mina ochel? Aren't they the same thing? Okay, it's matzinu ochel chamor mina ochel. That doesn't help that much. Change the ha'ochel to meichel. Ochel being the eater, and Michael being the food. So says Rabbi Eliezer, I'm going to bring you an example where the eater is actually more stringent than the food that was eaten. Now, according to you, Rabbi Yeshua, you're saying that the food is more stringent than the eater, right? According to you, Rabbi Yeshua, a person who eats food that's a rishon l'tumah drops down the level and becomes a sheni l'tumah. Yet, says Rabbi Eliezer, I'm going to bring you a scenario right now, a case right now, where actually a person who eats tumah becomes actually more stringent. Dilu nivlas of tahor. When it comes to a nivlas of tahor, a dead chicken, a dead unshechted chicken, a nevela chicken, it wasn't shechted properly. You have chicken that's a nevela. Bachutz lo mitama. If you go and touch that dead chicken, you won't be tameh. Nivlas of tahor is mitame begadim beis abliya. Beis abliya is the throat. When you swallow, if you were to then eat that chicken, when you eat it, when you swallow it, you become tameh, and not only do you become tameh, your clothing become tameh. Vilu ochla mitame begadim beis abliya. Ve'anu each lo naise ochel kimaychu. Says Rabbi Eliezer, look, we have the example of the nivlas of tahor. By nivlas of tahor, the ochel, the chicken, if you touch it, you won't become tameh. And yet, if a person eats it, well, what happens to that person? When they eat it, not only do they become tameh, even their clothing becomes tameh. So you have the food, the nivlas of tahor, which itself isn't even metameh, and yet the person who eats it, not only do they become tameh, they then even make their clothing tameh, which is a higher level of tumah. So it says Rabbi Eliezer, I don't understand. We see from the example of nivlas of tahor that the person who becomes tameh is more tameh than the food that he ate. So I don't understand, Rabbi Yeshua, why are you saying that the person who eats a rishon becomes less tameh and becomes a sheni l'tumah? Again, Amar Rabbi Eliezer, this is Rabbi Yeshua, matzinu ochel chomer min hamaychol, that the eater is more stringent than the food that was eaten. Dilu nivlas of tahor, when it comes to the nevela of the of tahor, so like a dead chicken. So the dead chicken itself, bachutz, when it's not inside your throat, when it's just lying there outside, lo mitame, it won't make you tameh. And yet, v'ilu ochla, when you eat it, mitame begadma beis abliya, not only do you become tameh, your clothes become tameh as well. V'anu, so I don't understand, says Rabbi Eliezer, he'achlo naise ochel kimaychol, how could it be that we're at the very least not making the eater like the food? That when this person eats a rishon l'tumah, he should at least be a rishon l'tumah, like I'm saying. Why are you saying that he's on a lower level of tumah and becomes knocked down to a sheni l'tumah? Rabbi Yoshua, whereas Rabbi Yoshua responds to Rabbi Eliezer, minivlas of Torah lo gaminon dechideshu. Rabbi Yeshua responds to Rabbi Eliezer and he says, don't ask me questions from nivlas of tahor, because nivlas of tahor is a chiddush, and it's a unique chiddush. You can't apply that generally to other cases. What's so special about nivlas of tahor? What makes nivlas of tahor so unique? Well, as we pointed out, number one, usually nevela, right? You touch a nevela, you have a sheep that drops dead. If you touch it, you become tameh. And here, by the nivlas of tahor, you don't become tameh. You touch a dead chicken, you don't become a nevela of a chicken, you don't become tameh. And interestingly, when do you become tameh by nivlas of tahor? When you swallow it, when you eat it. When you swallow it. When you swallow it, it's inside your body. That's what's called Tumah's beis hastarim. Tumah, that is a hidden tumah. And usually we'll say that that Tumah's beis hastarim is tahor. Usually, hidden tumah inside your body is tahor, is not tameh. And yet, by nivlas of tahor, by a dead chicken, not only is it weird and is it unique in that when you touch it, you're completely tahor, but when it's mitame you, where does it mitame you? Inside your throat. Tumah's beis hastarim. And not only that, how do you then become tameh? Not just a rishon l'tumah. You become tameh, and your clothing also becomes tameh. Whereas usually, you touch something tameh, you become tameh, and that's it. Your clothing doesn't become tameh. You become tameh. So for all those reasons, Nivlos of tahor is unique. When you touch it, you remain tahor. It's metame you inside of your throat, and yet it still makes you tummy. Not only are you tummy, your clothing is tummy. For all those reasons, nivlas of tahor, says Rabbi Yeshua, is completely unique. Don't ask me questions from it. It's its own anomaly. Ella rather fires back Rabbi Yeshua. Matzinu sha'maychol chomer min ha'ochel the ilu maychol b'kibeya ve'ochel ad ha'ochel kachatzi pras ve'anu each naise ochel kimaychol. Let me take a shluck of tea and we'll go right. Well, we'll explain that. Says Rabbi Yeshua that now I will prove you that the food is in fact actually more chamor than the person who eats the food. And I'll explain to you why I'm saying that a person who eats rishon becomes a sheni, gets knocked down to being a sheni l'tumah. Why the food itself is more chamor than the person who eats the food. And here's the proof. Tumas ochlin. Ruvain, the tomato. Ruvain, the tomato, is a rishon l'tumah. Shimon, the tomato, is not. Ruvain, the tomato, then touches Shimon, the tomato. Friends, what happens to Shimon, the tomato? Ruvain, the tomato, is a rishon l'tumah. He touches Shimon, the tomato. What happens to Shimon, the tomato? It's a trick question. The answer is it depends. If Ruvain, the tomato, is less than a kibeya, if Ruvain, the tomato, is smaller than the size of an egg, it cannot be mitame tumas ochlin. It can't transmit tumas ochlin. It can't make Shimon, the tomato, tame to be a sheni. In order for Ruvain, the tomato, who's a rishon l'tumah, to make Shimon, the tomato, a sheni l'tumah, Ruvain, the tomato, needs to be a kibeya, needs to be the size of an egg. However, once Ruvain, the tomato, is the size of an egg, that's enough. It's big enough. And as long as Ruvain, the tomato, is the size of an egg, if it touches Shimon, the tomato, since Ruvain is a rishon, Shimon becomes a sheni. Now, we've been talking about, until now, a person who eats tumah. Right? So let's say we're talking about Rabbi Yeshua's shita. So a person who eats tumah, food that's a rishon l'tumah, that person becomes a sheni l'tumah, according to Rabbi Yeshua. How much tumah does he have to eat? What, like a tiny amount? Is that enough? You have to eat a certain amount, right? The answer is, how much tumah does a person have to eat in order to become tameh himself? Half of a pras. What's half of a pras? What's a pras? So a pras is half of a loaf of bread. How big is that loaf of bread? It's machlekes Rashi and the Rambam. The Rambam says that loaf of bread is 6 eggs. Rashi says it's 8 eggs. We're going to go with 8 eggs because we'll go with Rashi. So Rashi says it is 8 eggs. A pras is half of that loaf of bread, 4 eggs. Half of a pras is 2 eggs. So the answer is, how much tumah does a person need to eat for himself to become tameh? 2 eggs worth of tumah. So we see, 2 eggs worth of tumah, he becomes tameh. So we see that the food is more stringent than the person eating the food. Because by Ruvain the tomato, once Ruvain the tomato is already the size of an egg, a kibeya, it's already able to transmit tumah to Shimon, to transmit tumah to Shimon the tomato. Once it's a kibeya. But for the person, it's more lenient. He doesn't become tummy until he eats 2 kibeyas of tumah. Only then does he become tummy. So we see that the food is more stringent than the person eating the food. And says Rabbi Yeshua, that is why when a person eats a rishon, right, food that's a rishon, he becomes a lower level of tumah, a sheni. Let's read it inside. Elamatzinu shamaychol chomer min ha'ochel, that we do in fact see that the food is more stringent than the person eating the food. De'ilu meichel, because the food, ruvein the tomato, b'kibeya, can already transmit tumah to Shimon the tomato, once Ruven the tomato is a kibeya. Once Ruven the tomato is a kibeya, it can transmit tumah to Shimon the tomato. Ve'ochel, whereas the eater, ad ochil kachatzi pras, he only becomes tameh once he eats half of a pras, which is 2 eggs worth, twice the amount, which is a leniency. So therefore, I don't understand, therefore, says Rabbi Yeshua, why are you saying that a person who eats a rishon also becomes a rishon? He should be knocked down to a sheni. He should be less stringent than the food that was eaten. Rabbi Eliezer, whereas Rabbi Eliezer fires back and he says, Tuma mishurin lo gamrinon. Rabbi Eliezer says, Rabbi Yeshua, you are assuming that there is a correlation between the chumrah of the shiur and the chumrah of the underlying tumah. You're assuming, Rabbi Yeshua, that, well, since the food has a more stringent shiur, so therefore it must be a more stringent tumah. And since the person eating it has a less stringent shiur, it must be a less stringent tumah. Says Rabbi Eliezer, that has nothing to do with it. The reason why Ruven the tomato is able to be matame at a kibbeh, when it's a kibbeh, has nothing to do with the severity of tumas ochlin. It has to do with the gzeres hakosov. The pasuk says mikola ochel asher yochel, and we say that achila is b'kizayis. Well, achila is b'kizayis, but the maximum I think that you can eat in one bite is a kibbeh. So we learn now that it's a kibbeh. So says Rabbi Eliezer, the fact that tumas ochlin is mitame b'kibeya has nothing to do with the stringency and the severity of tumas ochlin. It has to do with the gzeres hakosov. And the fact that a person who eats tumah only becomes tameh after 2 kibeyas has nothing to do with the leniency, any inherent leniency in the person eating the tumah. It's just that was the shiur that the Rabbanan made for becoming tameh. So therefore, says Rabbi Eliezer, I disagree with your mahalach, Rabbi Yeshua. I disagree that you're making a correlation between the strictness of the shiur for food versus the eater, and you're saying that's informative of the underlying severity of the tumah. Says Rabbi Eliezer, has nothing to do with it. One of them is gzeres hakosov, the other one's gzeres derabanan. Takana derabanan has nothing to do with any severity of tumah. You can't therefore say that that's why the ochel is a rishon and he's a sheni. Says Rabbi Eliezer, I don't buy it. V'od, and more so, says Rabbi Eliezer, how do you then explain why a person who eats a sheni letruma, a sheni letuma, Rabbi Yeshua, according to you, a person who eats a sheni letuma should become what? A shlishi letuma, right? But no, he becomes a sheni letuma. Why? According to you, Rabbi Yeshua, shata omer al rishon sheni yafe, ata omer, that, yeah, okay, fine. So Rabbi Yeshua, okay, so you just wanted to say that because of the shiurim, whatever. So therefore, a person who eats a rishon becomes a sheni. Fine. So Rabbi Eliezer says to Rabbi Yeshua, even if we accept that mahalach, so okay, so I can understand now, based on that mahalach, a person eats a food that's a rishon and becomes a sheni. But sheni lama. But a person who eats a sheni, why is he becoming a sheni? Shouldn't he then become a shlishi, get knocked down a level, if the food is more stringent than the eater? So Amrlo, it says Rabbi Yoshua, well, matzinu she'asheni o she'asheni ayidei mashkin. It says Rabbi Yoshua, well, here's the thing, we have a precedent that a sheni can make another sheni by way of mashkin. There's a Mishnah in Masechta Pareh that we're going to learn on the very next line. So I'm going to read it actually right now, and then we'll go back because we're skipping a few words. But if we go to the Mishnah on the next line, it says, "Kol apostle b'truma." Anything that's posel b'truma. What's posel b'truma? Truma becomes posel at the level of shlishi. So anything that's a sheni and is posel truma. Mitame mashkin can be mitame mashkin liquids. Leos tchila to be a rishon l'tuma, which will then be mitame other things be sheni l'tuma. 1 second, I'm going to take a break because my head is spinning, and I'll be right back in just a second. Okay, I'm back. So Rabbi Yoshua is defending why he says that if a person eats a sheni l'tuma, he himself becomes a sheni l'tuma and not a shlishi l'tuma. The answer is, based on the Mishnah that we just learned in Masechta, that we just quoted in Masechta Para. Ruvain the tomato. Up until now, Ruvain the tomato was a rishon l'tuma. In the new example, Rishon the tomato, Ruvain the tomato is a sheni l'tuma. Now, a sheni l'tuma cannot make a shlishi l'tuma by chulin. But listen to this. Ruvain the tomato is a sheni l'tuma. If Ruvain the tomato as a sheni l'tuma touches Shimon the tomato does not, it's chulin. It does not, there's no shlishi by chulin. So therefore, Shimon the tomato is tahor. And we're not talking about somebody who's makbid, the chulin ataris, trume or whatever. No, just stam, midoraisa. Ruvain the tomato is a sheni l'tuma. He touches Shimon the tomato. Shimon the tomato does not become a shlishi, does not become tamid. But if you had just washed Shimon the tomato, and there is some drops of water on the outside of Shimon the tomato, and Reuven the tomato touches that water that's on the outside of Shimon the tomato, right? Reuven the tomato, that's a sheni l'tuma, touches the water that's on the outside of Shimon the tomato, that water will become a rishon l'tuma. And as a rishon l'tuma, it will make Shimon the tomato a sheni l'tuma. This we learned about already in Masechta Brachos. We learned this about this in Masechta Brachos after less than 2 months of learning together. Now it's been 6 years. In the 8th parak of Masechta Brachos, we learned about this. That a sheni can make another sheni via mashkin. So says Rabbi Yoshua, since a sheni is able to make another sheni, and there's another important detail here, which is eating something is more chamor than touching. So now if these tomatoes, if Reuven the tomato can make Shimon the tomato, Reuven the tomato is a sheni, can make Shimon the tomato a sheni by touching, by way of mashke, but by touching, certainly by eating, certainly the sheni l'tuma, when eaten, will make the person who eats it also a sheni l'tuma. The person won't get downgraded to a shlishi, right? If by Reuven the tomato touching Shimon the tomato by way of the water, a sheni is making another sheni, well then certainly when we're talking about eating, if a sheni l'tuma is eaten, the person who eats it, which is a more chomer thing than touching, the person will be a sheni, not a shlishi. So says Rabbi Yoshua, since we see that a sheni can make another sheni, that is why a person who eats a sheni l'tuma himself becomes a sheni l'tuma and not a shlishi. So again, Amar Lo, 5 or 6 lines from the bottom of Lamadad Amar Aleph, Amar Lo, Rabbi Yeshua says to Rabbi Eliezer, Matzinu, we see, Shasheni osa sheni, that a sheni can make another sheni when it's al yidei mashkin via water. And that is why a person who eats a sheni l'tuma himself becomes a sheni l'tuma. Amar Lo, to which Rabbi Eliezer says, wait 1 second, Rabbi Yeshua, I'm getting dizzy. My head's spinning. Is anybody, wow, this is amazing. Is anybody else's head spinning? Amazing. I'm almost getting dizzy. Wow. It's unbelievable. So excited. My head is literally spinning. I had a feeling this was going to happen. Unbelievable. So says Rabbi Eliezer to Rabbi Yoshua, you are conveniently leaving out and trying to like sneak by a really important point, which is, there's a little bit of an elephant in the room. How did Reuven the tomato, which is a sheni l'tumah, make Shimon the tomato also a sheni l'tumah? By making the water that was on Shimon the tomato a rishon. So really, Reuven the tomato didn't directly make Shimon the tomato a sheni. Reuven the tomato, which was a sheni, made the water into a rishon, and it's the water that made Shimon the tomato into a sheni. But what did Reuven the tomato do? Reuven the tomato, as a sheni, made the water into a rishon. Says Rabbi Eliezer, that's the important thing. That Reuven the tomato, which is a sheni, made a rishon. And therefore, says Rabbi Eliezer, based on that, I would think that a person who eats a sheni should become a rishon. The Tanan, as we learned in the Mishnah in Parah that we read a few minutes ago, kol aposa b'truma, a sheni l'tuma, which makes truma pasul as a shlishi. So a sheni l'tuma, mitame mashkin, is mitame mashkin, lios tchila, that it makes it a rishon. And then that water, when it touches Shimon, since it's touching Shimon the tomato, Shimon the tomato will become a sheni. Chutz mitvuyom, a tvuyom as a status of a sheni l'tuma, but that the tvuyom won't make mashke into a rishon. Okay, so Rabbi Eliezer is systematically going through Rabbi Yoshua's very complex shita and questioning it. First, he questioned about why Rabbi Yeshua says that a rishon would become a sheni. Then he questioned why a sheni is becoming a sheni. And now he's questioning why, in the most complex part of Rabbi Yoshua's opinion, why a shlishi is making a sheni, and the whole kodesh and truma, that whole thing. Why is the shlishi making a sheni now? The Od, and more so asked Rabbi Eliezer to Rabbi Yeshua, shlishi sheni lama. Why is a shlishi l'tumah now making a sheni l'tumah when it's eaten? Why is a person who eats a shlishi l'tumah becoming a sheni l'tumah? So Amar lo, so Rabbi Yeshua says to Rabbi Eliezer, af ani lo amarti ela betruma shetarasa tuma hi eitza kodesh. Oh my. Before we explain this very complex line, the key to this whole behind the scenes was in what we just read right now. This whole behind the scenes was Rabbi Bar Bar Chana quoting Rabbi Yochanan. Ultimately, this was brought because Ula had said that Rabbi Bar Bar Chana holds that according to Rabbi Yoshua, there's no concept of a shlishi when it comes to chulin shenaisu al tairas hakodesh. According to Rabbi Bar Bar Chana, according to Rabbi Yoshua, there's a concept of a shlishi by chulin shenaisu al tairas hatruma. There's no concept of a shlishi for chulin shenaisu al tairas hakodesh. And that comes, the reason why Ula says that the Rabbi Bar Bar Chana holds that way is from this line that we just read. On my low, that Rabbi Yoshua says to Rabbi Eliezer, right? Well, let's even back up a few words. V'od shlishi sheni lama. Rabbi Eliezer asked Rabbi Yeshua, why is the shlishi making the person a sheni? Amar lo, Rabbi Yeshua says, af ani lo amarti ella. I only said, that's the key. Lo amarti ella. I only said bitruma. I only said that the shlishi that we're talking about is by truma, chulin shenaisu al tairas hatruma. Without explaining what that means as part of his answer, that's the key though. That Rabbi Yoshua is saying that I'm only saying that that there's a shlishi by chulin shenaisu al tairas hatruma, i.e., there's no shlishi by chulin shenaisu al tairas hakodesh. So that is why Ula says that it's Rabbi Bar Bar Chana who says that according to Rabbi Yoshua, there's only a shlishi by chulin shenaisu al tairas hatruma and not by chulin shenaisu al tairas hakodesh. Again, Amrlo af ani lo amarti elo betruma. The shlishi that we're talking about is by chulin shenaisu al tairas hatruma, not by chulin shenaisu ataris hakodesh. Okay, great, you got that. That was the whole point of the whole behind the scenes here. But now we have to explain what his answer is, and it's very complicated. So Amar lo, so read that again, second line from the bottom. Rabbi Yoshua responds to Rabbi Eliezer, Af ani lo amarti ela betruma, that so Rabbi Eliezer is asking Rabbi Yoshua, why is eating a shlishi making the person a sheni? Says Rabbi Yoshua, it's because, what's the shlishi that we're talking about? It's shlishi, it's a shlishi the tumah by chulin shanaisu al tyrus atruma, shetarasa tumah yietzel akodesh, that chulin shanaisu al tyrus atruma is tumah with relation to kodesh. What does that mean? Let me take a shluck of tea. In the meantime, in the 10 seconds that I take a shluck of tea, if anybody wants to take a stab at it, let us know. I mamish need to get a haircut and a beard trim. The beard trim more so than the haircut. Mamish can't take a sip of tea without having to dry my mustache off. But the thing is, taking a haircut takes time that I don't have. It's right now 7:00 p.m. I'm recording now about 12 hours later than I would normally record, maybe 10 hours later. This is a very demanding daf. Who's got time for haircuts? I mentioned earlier the Mishnah in Masechta Chagiga, Perek Beis Mishnah Vav, that we learned about on Friday or Shabbos or Sunday, whenever, I think on Shabbos actually. Daf Lamed, I think. That when it comes to going to the mikvah, if a person goes to the mikvah and has in mind chulin, so it only works for chulin, they won't be able to eat Meiser Sheni based on that mikvah. They'd have to go to the mikvah again with intention for Meiser Sheni, Meiser Sheni. If they have kavanah for Meiser Sheni, it wouldn't work for Truma. If they have intention for Truma, it wouldn't work for Kodesh. If they have intention for Kodesh, it wouldn't work to be able to work with the Meichadas of Paraduma. The key thing there, though, is that if a person goes to the mikvah with intention for Truma, it doesn't work to be able to eat kachim. It's irrelevant. You went to the mikvah, the same mikvah that you have to go to for Kodesh, but your kavanah was for Truma, it doesn't work. It's as if you didn't go to the mikvah. It doesn't work for Kodesh. Now, what we're talking about here, the truth is, what I feel like that's like no, it's not enough. No, no, we're about to get into the complicated stuff. I was thinking can't we just explain it? Wouldn't that have worked? No, it's not enough. The very next Mishnah, in Masechta Chagiga, Perek Beis Mishnah Zayin, discusses Tumas Midras. Who can tell me what Tumas Midras is? There are a few types of Tumas that have Tumas Midras. One type, for example, is a Zav, also a Nida. We'll get to that later. A Zav is an Ava Tumah. A Zav, he sees some kind of Ziva coming out of his you-know-what. He becomes a Zav. He sees it this happens 3 times over the course of, I believe 3 or less days. He becomes a Zav. So, he's an Avatuma. If you touch a Zav, you become Tameh and your clothing also becomes Tameh. Now, a Zav as a special type of Tumah, which is not unique to Zav, it also by Nida, by a Mitzora, by a Zava. By a Zav, there's something called Tumas Midras. Now, there are several ways that you could do Tumas Midras. We'll just use one example. If a Zav sits on a chair, that would be Tumas Moshav. He sits on a chair. That chair becomes just as tamei as he is. If he gets up and leaves the room, that chair is in Ava Tumah just like he is. If somebody now goes and sits on that chair or even touches the chair, that person becomes tamei and so does his clothing. Just like as if he would touch the Zav. That's what Tumas Midras is. Tumas Midras is that if a Zav, Tumas Midras Hazav is if a Zav sits there are several ways that he could have Tumas Midras, but one example is if he sits on a chair, that chair now becomes an Ava Tumah just like him, and if somebody touches it, or even sits on it, or picks it up, well, there are 7 ways that he can contract Midras Hazav. But you would become Tamei, and so would your clothing. Okay. Now, the Mishnah in Masechta Chagiga says that a person who is makbid to eat truma in a state of tara, right? So again, there are different levels. So you can have a person who's makbid to eat. Wait, did I just say truma in a state of tara? Truma always needs to be in a state of tara. Somebody who's makbid to eat chulin al tara sa truma. So somebody eats truma and he says, look, I want to make sure that everything that I eat with the same level of purity as if it was truma. So even as chulin, he eats al tara sa truma. That's a very holy thing to do. Great. However, the Mishnah in Chagiga says that his clothing, I want to quote you the Mishnah. Big day ochle truma. People who are makbid to eat chulin al tara sa truma, their clothing midras lakodesh. For somebody who's makbid to eat chulin al tara sa kodesh, which is a higher level, if you have Ruvain who's makbid to eat chulin al tara sa truma, and Shimon is makbid to eat chulin al tara sa kodesh, the fact that Ruvain is makbid to eat chulin al tara sa truma is completely irrelevant. Completely irrelevant. The fact that Reuven is makbid to make sure that he remains tahor and that he's always washing his hands, and he remains tahor, so that when he's eating truma, he's tahor, which basically means that he's makbid to make sure he's tahor. For Shimon, as far as Shimon is concerned, completely irrelevant. So much so that Shimon has to be concerned that maybe Reuven's wife, when she was a nida, sat on his clothing, and that his clothing now is basically has the same level of tumas anida. And if Shimon touches Reuven's clothing, Shimon's now going to be tamei. Which means that somebody who's makbid to be shomer, to guard, and to uphold levels of purity so that he can eat truma, vis-a-vis somebody who's makbid for kodesh, right? So Reuven is makbid for truma, Shimon is makbid for kodesh. Any stringencies, any precautions that Reuven's taking for truma, completely irrelevant for Shimon, who's makbid for kodesh. And therefore, how does that relate to what Rabbi Yeshua is saying? Rabbi Eliezer is asking Rabbi Yeshua, why is somebody who's eating a shlishi becoming a sheni? And Rabbi Yeshua answers, because what's the shlishi? The shlishi that I'm talking about is chulin shenaisu al tara sa truma, and that's why we're treating it as a shlishi. However, for somebody who's makbid to eat chulin al tara sa kodesh, this is completely irrelevant. The fact that we're talking about chulin shenaisu al tara sa truma, as far as somebody who's makbid to eat chulin al tara sa kodesh is concerned, is completely irrelevant. And that is why, as far as we're concerned for kodesh, because remember, what does Rabbi Yeshua say? Somebody who eats this shlishi becomes a sheni vis-a-vis kodesh. We said vis-a-vis truma. If he touches truma, it does not become tamei, or pasul more specifically. But we do treat him as a sheni, that if he touches kodesh, it becomes a shlishi. That's because the fact that this is chulin shenaisu al taras truma is completely irrelevant as far as somebody who's makbid for kodesh is concerned, and therefore we're concerned that, you know what, maybe this wasn't actually a shlishi, maybe, right, because it was al taras truma, which for somebody for kodesh is completely irrelevant. As far as we're concerned for kachim, maybe this wasn't actually a shlishi, maybe it was higher up, maybe it was a sheni. And if this food is a sheni, it would make the person who eats it a sheni. And that's why we're being more stringent, because we're talking about kodshim. for Kodesh, we're being more stringent, and we're going to say, you know what, maybe we have to be concerned that maybe this food wasn't a shlishi, maybe it was a sheni. And as a sheni, it's going to make the person who eats it into a sheni, as we said up until now, that a sheni makes a sheni. And as a sheni, when he touches Kodesh, it would make it into a shlishi. Okay, what do you want me to tell you? So again, Amar Lo, so Rabbi Yeshua responds to Rabbi Eliezer, Afani lo amarti ella. I'm saying, what's this shlishi? It's bitruma. It's chulin shenaisa altarisa truma. Shetarasa, that the fact that it's chulin shenaisa altarisa truma, Tumah he eats al kodesh. As far as kodesh is concerned, this tyra is tumah. It's completely irrelevant, and therefore we're stringent and we're concerned that maybe the shlishi, which is chulin shenaisa altarisa truma, is really actually a sheni, and it's going to make the person tasheni to make the true any kodesh that it touches into a shlishi. And that was, as I pointed out earlier, how Ula proves that according to Rabbi Bar Chana, because this whole thing was Rabbi Bar Chana and then Rabbi Yochanan, from the fact that Rabbi Yeshua had said, Af ani lo amarti ella betruma, we learned from there that Rabbi Yeshua holds that only chulin anaisa altaris truma can make a shlishi, but chulin shenaisa altaris kodesh doesn't make a shlishi according to Rabbi Bar Chana. And therefore, our Mishnah, going back to our Mishnah, when we're saying that if there was blood and his hands are a sheni, it would make the meat into a shlishi, and we're talking about chulin shenaisa altaris kodesh, can't be, according to Rabbi Bar Chana, cannot be Rabbi Yeshua. Amar Reb Zera, Amar Reb Asi, Amar Reb Yochanan, that's important. Amar Reb Yochanan, because we just saw Rabbi Bar Chana quoting Rabbi Yochanan. Now we have Amar Reb Zera, Amar Reb Asi, Amar Reb Yochanan, Amar Reb Yanai. Ha'ochel shlishi shel chulin shenaisa altaris hakodesh. So this is basically going to be very similar to Rabbi Yeshua's opinion, but we're saying that it's chulin shenaisa altaris hakodesh. So a person who eats a shlishi by chulin shenaisa altaris hakodesh, naisa gufo sheni, he becomes a sheni la kodesh when it comes to kodesh. Basically, it's the shita of Rabbi Yeshua. However, instead of saying chulin shenaisa altaris truma, it's chulin shenaisa altaris kodesh. Eis ve Reb Zera le Reb Asi, but Reb Zera asked a kasha to Reb Asi, shlishi sheni la kodesh, ve'ein sheni la truma. One second, right? So Reb Zera. So again, Eis ve Reb Zera le Reb Asi, Reb Zera asked a kasha on Reb Asi from our Mishnah. That one second, Reb Asi, you just quoted Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Yanai. You basically just quoted Rabbi Yeshua's opinion, but you had said it by chulin shenaisa altaris kodesh. But one second, our Mishnah, the Mishnah in Tyrus had said, shlishi, that a shlishi is a sheni la kodesh, right? That if you touch kodesh, it becomes a shlishi. Ve'ein sheni la truma, and it's not a sheni la truma. We're just quoting that Mishnah that we had earlier from Tyrus. Bechulin shenaisa altaris truma. It's chulin shenaisa altaris truma, not chulin shenaisa altaris hakodesh. Altaris truma in, altaris hakodesh lo. The Mishnah is not talking about altaris hakodesh, talking about altaris truma. So Amar le. So Reb Asi says to Reb Zera, lo mi baya kamar. It's like Ula had said earlier, that certainly what the Mishnah is saying is that certainly truma chulin shenaisa altaris kodesh, which is more stringent than truma, would make a shlishi, and even chulin shenaisa altaris truma makes a shlishi as well. But we had just quoted Rabbi Yochanan a few minutes ago, right? That was the whole thing with Rabbi Bar Chana and then Rabbi Yochanan. Af ani lo amarti ella b'truma, and not by chulin shenaisa altaris kodesh. So Amarai Ninu Ba'alibud Rabbi Yochanan answers the Gemara. Well, apparently there's a machlok Amarai about what Rabbi Yochanan said. Rabbi Bar Chana had quoted Rabbi Yochanan to say that Rabbi Yeshua's shita is davka by chulin shenaisa altaris truma, but apparently Rabbi Asi is quoting Rabbi Yochanan that He could even be talking about chulin shneisu ataris ha kodesh. Amar Ula says Ula, ha ochel. Now this is Chevra. If you remember earlier, I had pointed out that in Rabbi Yoshua's Shita, that he says that somebody eats a shlishi by chulin shenaisu ataras atruma. So a person eats that shlishi. So we say he only becomes a sheni for kodesh. Now in terms of truma, we say he doesn't become a sheni. He's not a sheni for truma. And therefore, a person who eats this shlishi by chulin shenaisu ataras atruma, he's not a sheni for truma. And if he touches truma, he's not going to be postal truma. So as I said earlier, he's not a sheni for truma, but he is a shlishi for truma. A person who eats this shlishi by chulin shenaisu ataras truma, he does become a shlishi vis-a-vis truma, and he's tummy, he can't eat truma. Right? It's a misa b'dei shemayim if a tummy person eats truma. So Amar Ula says Ula, ha'ochel shlishi shel chulin shenaisu ataras truma. So when we're talking about a shlishi of chulin shenaisu ataras truma, like we've been talking about most of the time, so nifsal gufo milecho b'truma. So effectively, he becomes a shlishi l'tuma to the extent that he's puzzle, he's not allowed to eat truma. He's a shlishi l'tuma. He ate this shlishi l'tuma by chulin shenaisu ataras truma. He ate the shlishi. He now becomes a shlishi. He can't eat truma. My kamash malon tanina. But why do we need Ula to teach me this? Can we infer that from our Mishnah? That Rabbi Yoshua says that when you eat chulin shenaisu ataras truma, shlishi, that by eating this shlishi, sheni la kodesh, you become a sheni la kodesh, and if you touch kodesh, it becomes a shlishi. The ain sheni la truma. He's not a sheni for truma. Bechulin shenaisu ataras truma. When we're talking about chulin shenaisu ataras truma, sheni udelava. Yeah, he's not a sheni by truma. Hashlishi ava, but he is a shlishi by truma, and he's not allowed to eat truma. So says the Gemara, Imeahi, if we only were being medayik from the Mishnah and we didn't have Ula, Hava Amina lo sheni avi v'lo shlishi avi. I might think that what Rabbi Yeshua is saying is that as far as truma is concerned, he's not a sheni, he's not a shlishi, he's nothing as far as truma is concerned. V'adi do Omar sheni bakodesh, and so why do we mention sheni? Right, he's not a sheni for truma, which implies that he is a shlishi for truma. So why say, if we're saying no, he's not a sheni nor a shlishi, so why say anything about truma? Well, the Omar sheni ba kodesh. Well, since we said that he's a sheni vis-a-vis kodesh, Omar nami ain sheni ba truma. That, and when it comes to truma, he's not a sheni. But I could argue it's not. Don't infer from there. But he is a shlishi. So kamash malan. Therefore, I need Ula to say, no. Do infer that. It's correct to say that he's not a sheni by truma, but he is a shlishi and he can't eat truma. Eisvei Rav Amnuna le'ula. Rav Amnuna asks a kasha against Ula, who says that if he eats the shlishi, he's not allowed to eat truma. Harishin shebachulin tamei u'metame. This is, up until now, we've been quoting the machlokes between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua from Mishnayos Tyrus. Perek Beis Mishnah Beis. This is Perek Beis Mishnah Gimel, the very next Mishnah in Tyrus. Harishon Shabachulin, a Rishon Tumah, right? So Ruvain the Tameda is a Rishon Tumah, or whatever. Forget about Ruvain the Tameda for now. If you have a Rishon Tumah by Chulin, Tameh, it is Tameh Umetame, and it can make a Sheni Tumah, and that Sheni Tumah will be Tameh, and it can even make a Shlish Tumah by Truma. The Sheni, but if we have a Sheni Latuma by Chulin, Posel, it's Posel Truma, the Eino Mitame, right? This is something we've been discussing. That it's what's called Posel Truma, it's not Mitame Truma, right? It could be Mitame Kodesh, because Mitame means that you're making something Tame to then be able to be Tame other things. Mitame other things. Now, when a Sheni makes Truma Tame, it's posel, i.e. the Truma is unable to be Mitame other things at that point. So it's posel, ve'enu Mitame. It makes Truma posel, it does not make Truma Tame, i.e. the Truma can no longer be Mitame other Truma. The Ashlishi, what about a Shlishi the Tumah, but when we're talking about Chullin Shnaisa Ataris HaKodesh, Truma. Ne'echol b'nizid hadema. What's a nizid? Vayozed Yaakov nazid. The pasuk says in the first aliyah of Parshas Toldos, it's a stew. Right? Yaakov Avinu was preparing a lentil stew. So we say that by Shlishi, Nechol can be eaten b'nizid adema. Dema is like meduma. Dema is a mixture that has truma in it. So we're saying when it comes to a shlishi, if you have a stew that becomes a shlishi l'tuma, imagine we're talking about by chulin shenaisu atayas truma, and it becomes a shlishi l'tuma. So you can even eat it. So if a person eats this stew that becomes a shlishi l'tuma, and he eats it, he can even eat it if it has spices of truma that are mixed into the stew. Which means that here you have, if what we had said is that a person who eats a shlishi becomes himself a shlishi and therefore he's not allowed to eat truma, then how could it be that we're saying that this person who eats this stew that's a shlishi is allowed to eat it even if there is truma spices mixed into it? If you say that a person who eats a shlishi, he's not allowed to eat truma. Safina le midi depostle legufe. I don't understand. Why would we say that he's allowed to eat this nazir adema? Why is he allowed to eat this stew that has truma spices in it? If it's a shlishi, he should be prohibited from eating these spices, from eating truma. So Amalei, to which Ula responds of Amnuna, Hanach lenazir adema. Don't ask me questions from a stew that has a little bit of spice in it. Whenever we talk about something that you're not allowed to eat, it means that you're not allowed to eat a kazayis of it within tochid achilas pras, which is a few minutes. The amount of time that it would take to eat. If you have we talked about earlier, if you have a loaf that's 8 eggs worth, half of that would be a pras. So the amount of time that it would take to eat 4 eggs worth of bread, which is a few minutes. So when we talk about, so we're saying this person is a shlishi, he's not allowed to eat truma. It means he's not allowed to eat a kazayas of truma within a few minutes. Some spices in a stew, I don't even know if there's a kazayas of spice in the whole stew. And even if there is, you're not going to eat a kazayas of it within a few minutes. So therefore, that is why he's allowed to eat this stew, but he would not be allowed to eat truma. Friends, we made it. We did it. I hope everyone's, how's your heads doing? Oh man, I think my head is spinning a little bit. That was Daf Lamed Daled of Masechta Chullin. Honestly, I don't really know so much what to say about Daf Lamed Daled of Masechta Chullin, other than we were still working on answering the question of our Mishnah that says that if a person shechs an animal and his hands are sheni l'tumah, and blood got on the neck of the animal, which made the meat mukhshel l'kabel tumah, then his hands that are sheni l'tumahs would make the animal tamei. And the question is why? And today we said because we're talking about chulin. Sure, the animal was chulin, but it's chulin shnaisu ataris hakodesh, that we're makbid to have all the stringencies as if it was a korban, and therefore it would make a shlishi l'tumah by kodesh. We had then said that is unlike Rabbi Yoshua, because Rabbi Yoshua his shita is that there's no concept of a shlishi l'tumah when it comes to chulin shenaisu ataris hakodesh, and we brought the Mishnah from Tyrus where that comes from, the machlokas between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yoshua. Rabbi Eliezer says that a person who eats a rishon becomes a rishon, sheni becomes a sheni, shlishi becomes a shlishi. Rabbi Yoshua had a much more complicated opinion that betzim a rishon becomes a sheni becomes a sheni, a shlishi becomes a sheni for kodesh but not for truma, but he still can't eat truma. We explored every facet of that machlokas, which I'm not going to get into now, but be'etzem we saw that was the opinion of Rabbi Bar Chana, who says that our Mishnah would be unable to be like Rabbi Yoshua. However, we saw the opinion of Ula and also Rav Asi, who said that our Mishnah can even be like Rabbi Yeshua. Friends, I think we'll leave it there, and I will catch you tomorrow for Daf Lamed Hey, Daf 35 in Masechta Chullin. This was Daf Lamed Daled Masechta Chullin. Everyone, maybe take a Tylenol, maybe take an Advil or something. Have a good one. Cheers.